Good evening. My name is Maggie Colville, and I'm the Executive Director of Colorado Humanities. Welcome to How Did We Get Here? The first in a series of programs to encourage understanding and discussion about the legacy of race in America and how to make changes now for a more just future. Thank you to media sponsor, the Durango Herald, Ground Floor Media and Center Table, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and many community partners who are posting or streaming the program right now. A special thank you to Mike Ferrafino of the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce for providing media production services, and thank you to Christine Goff for helping with this production as well. I'd also like to take a minute to recognize the board and staff members on our Changing the Legacy of Race and Ethnicity Committee, and especially Director of Programs Josephine Jones, Nora Ridgway, and our committee chair Paulette Tate for her huge commitment of time and energy to creating this program and making it possible. Another committee member, Adrian Miller, will be our moderator tonight. Adrian is a Denver native, James Beard Award-winning author, former special assistant to President Bill Clinton, former senior policy analyst for Colorado Governor Bill Ritter, recovering attorney, and a certified barbecue judge. He is the executive director of the Colorado Council of Churches and has served on the Colorado Humanities Board since 2017. Please welcome Adrian Miller.
Thank you, Maggie. Good evening. I'm Adrian Miller, and I serve as a Colorado Humanities Board member, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual gathering. Because of the ongoing and tragic race-related events that have happened in our society, Coloradans are searching. We're searching for ways to understand what happened and why these things continue to happen. We are searching for ways to understand each other, and we're searching for ways to come together and create a better future. We've been reading about racial justice, we've listened to people share their experiences, and we've sought inviting spaces where these difficult, painful, and challenging issues can be honestly discussed. To meet this moment, Colorado Humanities, under the umbrella of its Changing the Legacy of Race and Ethnicity program series, is hosting a series of virtual events to explore various aspects of racial justice. We're calling them Conversations for One America. Tonight is our first event, and it's titled, How Did We Get Here? We've gathered 4 subject matter experts from different fields who will give you different perspectives on how to answer that vital question. These experts will give you the backstory on racism and racial justice by looking through the lenses of criminal justice, economics, history, and psychology. In terms of the program flow tonight, each of the experts will speak, and I'll ask a few questions for everyone, and then we'll discuss a few of the questions that attendees submitted when they signed up for this event. Now, on that point, I have some good news and some bad news. The bad news is that you all submitted so many great questions, we just don't have enough time to get to all of them. The good news is that we've already thought about some of the issues raised in your questions for future installments of this series. So we look forward to that. Changing the legacy of race and ethnicity is vitally important in this time. Without a closer scrutiny of such topics, a shared, multiracial society where equality and justice exists will remain elusive. So thank you for joining us for this important discussion. So our first expert tonight is Wendell PRYOR. He is the Executive Director of the Chaffee County Economic Development Corporation. Wendell, you have the floor.
Thank you, Adrian, and I'm honored to be part of this program. Thank you, Colorado Humanities, and Maggie. I was a former board member of Colorado Humanities, so it's a pleasure to come back to you. And so since I had the opportunity to kind of kick it off, I thought I'd provide something of a framework. In my educator role, I'm not a tenured professor like Dr. Harding, but I have taught diversity and inclusion at the School of Public Affairs, University of Colorado for well over a dozen years. So I do consider myself somewhat of an expert, and I'm actually doing some training here in Colorado Springs. So what I wanted to build on is this notion of legacy very quickly, which I tried to look it up and come up with a definition. And typically we think about something of value that's handed down from generation to generation. And I think in this context, let's get right to the point. We're talking about race and our history with racial justice or injustice in this society, which happens to be the topic of the moment. So I wanted to provide a framework that hopefully will help set the table, if you will. I thought about that one, Adrian, before I did this, in terms of the discussion we're about to have. So I wanted to go quickly to the definition and the distinction between equality and equity. They're typically used interchangeably, but when we talk about equality, it's typically defined as treating everyone the same and giving everyone access to the same opportunities, while equity refers to proportional representation by race, class, gender, which I think brings us to the current moment where we're talking about racial equity and injustice. And in that context, the framework that I want to provide is from a book that I taught a class last summer from, and I'll make it available to the Colorado Humanities. It's called The Hidden Rules of Race. And in it, it posits or offers a framework, if you will, for looking at racial rules that tend to dictate outcomes that we often call disparities. And it gives us 6 domains, if you will, to be thinking about when we talk about the racial injustice and legacy. And the 6 domains are wealth, income, education, criminal justice, health, and democratic participation. And basically the theory of the book is that there are racial rules that are baked into society that create some of the disparities and the injustices that we face. And almost ironic and right on cue, last week's Denver Business Journal had some statistics that I wanted to just highlight from their review of the Small Business Administration's SBA program, their 7A program. And again, I think it couldn't be more timely for this discussion. It says that basically a Stanford study of the pandemic's effects found 41% of Black businesses ceased operations as of April, compared with 17% of white businesses. Relief measures have lagged. A review by the New York Times of a key COVID relief program, the Federal Paycheck Protection Program, showed 75% of the government's initial round of emergency loans went to businesses in white census tracts. They cannot track it by race, so they look at census tracts, and that was one of the outcomes. It goes on further to say that the country's 4 biggest banks, which held roughly 35% of the nation's deposits, made 91% fewer 7A loans to Black-owned businesses in 2019 than in 2007. Citibank made 2 in 2019, Bank of America made 7, JP Morgan Chase made 62, and Wells Fargo made 263. By comparison, those same banks originated at least 5,443 7A loans to all businesses during the SBA's fiscal 2009. Majority Black census tracts with more than 500 people averaged $157 in small business loans per person in 2018. Majority white census tracts averaged $302. A couple more just brief statistics, and then I'll close. It says Black household wealth in America is roughly 1/10 white household wealth. The Black home ownership rate is roughly 30 percentage points lower than the white home ownership rate. And I want to make a quick statement there. Typically, white ownership rates hovers around 60% or more. Black home ownership rates average around in the 40s, and Hispanics are just slightly better than that. And if you look at housing as a way that we accumulate wealth in this country, that statistic is telling. And before I close, I just want to cite that during my tenure as the state civil rights director, we investigated one of the country's largest predatory lending scams, and it had to do with Mexican and Latino households in Greeley, Colorado. The reason that significant is that the officer of the bank that did the predatory lending fled to Mexico and was later arrested, having been on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. So it is predatory in that sense. And then I'll just close with this last statistic. It says the SBA 7A program, which guarantees as much as 90% of loans made by banks, doled out $23.2 billion in 2019, including $755 million to Black-owned businesses. So that points out the disparities, and I hope provides a little bit of a framework of what it is we're going to be talking about when we talk about the legacy of race in this country. So I'll stop with that and yield my time, Adrian.
Thank you so much, Wendell, for giving us that economics lens. Next in this all-star lineup, we have Denise Maez, Esquire, who oversees all legislative work that affects civil liberties in the state of and the local level in Colorado as the public policy director of the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union of Colorado. Denise.
Hi, Adrian. Thank you very much. And thank you to the Colorado Humanities. And Wendell, that was a really important and really some good numbers that you gave us to digest and think about. I think in the criminal justice system, there actually are so many areas and so many issues to discuss where racial equity and justice intersects. And what I opted to do this evening is to talk a little bit about something that is right in front of us, and that is the COVID-19 epidemic. Now, the COVID-19 epidemic, as I often say, the virus itself is not racist, but it sure has uncovered a very long and systemic racist history. The virus, once flattening, is now, as we all have been reading, it is now on the uptick. I think a lot of us knew that that was inevitable. But there is one less told story, and that is that the virus also plagues our jails and prisons. Indeed, what may be largely unknown and not reported widely is that the largest outbreak of the virus in the state of Colorado is in Colorado state prisons. Hundreds have tested positive, and many have died. Prisons, you see, are a virus's delight. There is no way that anyone behind bars, behind the wall, can adhere to CDC guidelines. There is no 6 feet distancing. Folks incarcerated congregate in numbers greater than 10. They stand shoulder to shoulder in line to use the shower, to use the telephone, and to access their food. And when there is an outbreak in a prison facility, the entire facility goes on lockdown. That means no visitors come in, no packages come in, and there is very, very, very little interaction between individuals that are housed there and their families, friends, and neighbors who live on the other side. Now, you see, the United States and Colorado, similarly, we have an addiction. We have an addiction to incarceration, jails, and prisons. Here in the United States, we incarcerate more people than any other nation in the world. And the data tells us we are no safer. Our prison system was founded on racist principles, and our prisons in Colorado reflect this historical racist past. We disproportionately, in Colorado, like all over the country, disproportionately incarcerate brown, Black, and Indigenous people. We have devastated so many families in communities of color. So many children grow up with one parent because the other is incarcerated. Michelle Alexander, who is the author of Mass Incarceration, The New Jim Crow, wrote, "Who is behind bars in cages has more to do with our collective choices rather than individual ones." Prisons are death traps. While I and many of you and many of us here can work remotely, albeit with its own set of difficulties for different folks, many will die in our prisons. And these individuals will be predominantly, overwhelmingly, and disproportionately Black, brown, and Indigenous people. These people, those people, are human beings, and they're caught up in an inequitable system. Communities of colors are over-policed and therefore have more encounters with police and therefore are arrested at greater rates. They get longer sentences than their white counterparts for similar crimes. And re-entry into the system, into communities, they have to go through far more barriers. They are people like Anthony Martinez. I'm going to tell you about Anthony Martinez. He's 84 years old. He's in a Colorado prison. He has a clemency petition before the governor. He suffers from dementia. He needs a wheelchair to get around. He has a niece who wants him to come home. He's not up for parole until 2026, if he lives that long. You see, no one gains from keeping Mr. Martinez in prison. What we have seen over the last 7 months is that jails, unlike prisons, jails, county jails, have reduced their jail population by over 40%. And as a result of that depopulation, we are not less safe. I hope and I pray that we learn from COVID-19 not only the obvious that mass incarceration is itself a public health crisis, and that we all are safer with fewer people behind bars. When we say out in the streets and to one another that Black Lives Matter, I hope we mean all Black Lives Matter. And those lives include individuals in our prisons who have done their time and need not be in that cage any longer. The bottom line, mass incarceration is a racial justice issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. Next, we have Dr. Anthony Young, who is president of the Denver Rocky Mountain Association of Black Psychologists. Dr. Young.
Hi, good evening, Adrian. It's a pleasure to be with you. This is a very difficult conversation for Coloradans to have and Americans in general, because there's never been an authentic conversation, a national conversation on racism at all. In fact, I believe former President Clinton started the conversation, but that was sidetracked by the Monica Lewinsky scandal. So in 2020, we know that racism has been rampant in America since its very beginning. And I would like to share with you my perspective from a psychosocial historical vantage point. First of all, let me give you a couple of definitions first. According to Dr. Wade Nobles, who's one of the past national presidents of the Association of Black Psychologists, power is the ability to influence other people to accept your definition of reality as their own. And we know that race itself is a social construct. It does not exist in biology. However, if you believe a thing is real, it becomes very real in its consequences. So when I talk about race, I would like to give another definition, because at the very core of understanding how we got here in as far as race in the US, it's very important to understand the psychology of white supremacy. And to be polite and less clear, it is sometimes called racism. It is seldom defined, and therefore there's a multitude of conflicting definitions. So for my discussion, I've chosen the definition created by Neely Fuller Jr. that was advanced by the late Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, which basically states that white supremacy is the direct or indirect subjugation of non-white people by white people for the basic purpose of pleasing and or serving any or all white persons at all times, in all places, in all areas of activity, including economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. And structural or systemic racism is just simply a manifestation of white supremacy. Now, white supremacy also includes the belief in the genetic superiority of white people over all others. It is a nationwide system of belief and behavior, and it is the only functional racism in existence on the planet that is based on color and or anti-color in the physical makeup or physical appearance of a person. So when this belief of white superiority also comes the idea of white privilege, and that people of color must be placed at a disadvantage in every possible way. Adherents of white supremacy see that equity, fair treatment, and the protection of rights of people of color as a direct threat to their privilege. Direct threat to a white privilege, to be very specific. So here's a quote by Neely Fuller that also goes further, that says, if you don't understand white supremacy, what it is and how it functions and how it operates, everything that you think you know will only confuse you. And Dr. Martin Luther King talked about this very well. In fact, I might mention that in September of 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King spoke as a keynote presenter for the American Psychological Association National Convention. And during that convention, he challenged the white psychologists to use their skill and tools to eradicate racism and discrimination. Of course, his appeal fell on deaf ears. So for us to engage in this type of conversation in 2020 is very difficult, because every American has been miseducated about our history, our culture. And we know that the history of the country primarily has been created by the people who were the conquerors, and they told their story from their vantage point. However, we do know that the educational system itself continued to miseducate all Americans, because people of color and their contributions throughout the development of this nation is very seldom mentioned in any meaningful way. We know that the challenges that must be considered is that when white supremacy is threatened by those who actually control the institutions and resources of this country, when they are challenged, the challenges are usually met with resistance, resentment, hostility, punishment, and or terrorism. And in fact, those of you who know anything about American history know that there has never been a period in American history when African Americans were not terrorized. And of course, other people of color as well, but specifically since Africans were kidnapped, enslaved, and brought to this nation. There's a particular psychology that goes with white supremacy, and that's once again is the belief in the inferiority of people who are non-white. But in addition to that, there's this dehumanizing of people, and then objectifying them so that they're seen more as objects to be used. And this is actually very well covered in some of the writings of Ida B. Wells, Douglas Blackmun, who's the author of Slavery by Another Name, as well as an interesting book by, I think it's Thomas Foster, who wrote the Rethinking Rufus, which is an excellent text to talk about not only were enslaved Africans, children, women, but also men were sexually abused during that entire period of the American enslavement. We know that white supremacy requires the creation, justification, and perpetuation of false narratives and histories that support the lie of inferiority of Black Americans and other non-white people. These have also been embraced by every societal institution, particularly in education, the media, politics, etc. And I know that I'm kind of going over time just a little bit, but let me just close by saying that if you begin to take a look at the type of cognitive dissonance which is created by white people who begin to wake up to this reality that we have all lived in regarding white supremacy, the cognitive dissonance refers to the uncomfortable feelings that people experience when they are confronted with two conflicting ideas. And as people become more aware of how devastating and how insidious and evil white supremacy has been, and that it's been baked into our nation all the way from the very beginning with the Constitution, and then laws were created by Congress, and of course those laws were upheld by the Supreme Court. And we could go on and on and on. But the fact is that there's a psychology that goes along with the practice and the behaviors which are quite obvious to us in terms of interpersonal racism and also structural racism as well. So there's some wonderful resources that I listed, which should be available to you. The title of the reference page for the resources is The Psychology of White Supremacy. And this has been examined by a number of experts, such as Dr. Marima Ani in her book Urugu, or Dr. Robert V. Guthrie, who wrote Even the Rat Was White, which is the history of psychology and its racist origins. Dr. Edwin Nichols also explores this in terms of how racists tend to objectify Black people and other people of color for exploitation. But there's an excellent book also by Dr. Ibram Kendi, Stamped from the Beginning. He's also the author of How to Become an Anti-Racist.
Hey, Dr. Young?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm going to have to kind of cut you off here a little bit to keep it moving so we can stay within our time. So if you have a closing comment, sorry to interrupt you.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, go ahead. If you have a closing wrap-up comment.
I do. My closing comment is basically is that there has not been enough education or discussion about how white supremacy started, how it is manifested in our various social institutions, as well as in interpersonal interactions. So we have to be willing to engage in a courageous conversation in order to help heal the nation, because without that, we will continue to have conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Young. And next we have Dr. Rachel Harding, who is a historian and poet who, as a professor, specializes in religions of the Afro-Atlantic diaspora. And Dr. Harding has promised to say her piece in rhyme, I think. No, I'm just kidding. We'll turn it over to Dr. Harding.
Great. Hello, everybody. Good evening. I'm glad to be with you tonight, even though unfortunately I'm not going to rhyme, but I'm happy to be among this very thoughtful panel of presenters. And I thank Adrian Miller and the staff and administrators of Colorado Humanities for the invitation. As Adrian said, I am a poet and historian, and the history I teach and study is the history of people of African descent in the Americas. Our nation, the United States, was founded on a stark contradiction between the rhetoric of independence, equality, and democracy on one hand, and on the other, the reality of the great plunder of native lands and the enslavement and exploitation of Africans. Throughout the revolutionary period, the mid and late 18th century, Black people petitioned leaders of the independence movement and of the newly formed government for their rights to freedom and equal citizenship. However, the Constitution's framers could never bring themselves to fully recognize and reconcile the deep contradiction between the values they espoused on paper and the fact that many of them were themselves holding human beings in bondage and amassing great wealth in that way. This is a contradiction or a schizophrenia that marks the nation to the present day. And African Americans have been among the people who most consistently demand that the country recognize this schizophrenia and work to heal itself of it. We are where we are because for 250 years, our country chose to make race-based slavery the cornerstone of the nation's political economy, and for another 100 years after the abolition of slavery, with a very brief moment during Reconstruction where the possibility of a multiracial democracy emerged and was violently crushed. This nation enabled generations of terroristic violence against Black individuals and communities and other communities of color, enshrined segregation and the humiliation of Black people, and empowered itself on the plunder, looting, and suffocation of Black economic and civic strength by means of a wide range of local, state, and national laws and customs. So although I would say that the present situation of highly militarized state-sponsored violence against Blacks, Latinos, Native people, and other marginalized folks in our country is a result of the growth over the past 40 or 50 years of a particularly virulent resistance to the push for racial, gender, and economic justice in our country, there is, in truth, a very long history here of structural inequality scaffolded by violences of many kinds. Poverty in one of the wealthiest nations in the world is a form of violence. Red-lined communities that are food deserts but full of liquor stores is a form of violence. The racial bias of medical professionals and the insistence on for-profit medicine is a form of violence. Violence is predatory lending and evictions. Violence is the incarceration of massive numbers of Black, brown, Native, and poor people. Violence is decimating the Voting Rights Act and insisting that voters in some places stand in line for 5 hours in a pandemic to cast their ballots. Violence is the chronic overfunding of police and prisons and military, and the underfunding of public education, mental health, social services, the arts and humanities, the things that make a meaningful civic life possible in a democracy. There are many kinds of violence that bring us to where we are today. My time is short, and I really wish we had an extended period to talk together about these things, but I'll close my comments with what I hope are some encouraging words from the Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe and the African-American poet Gwendolyn Brooks. Both Mbembe and Brooks come out of traditions that honor relationality. As in the ancestral practices of indigenous and colonized peoples in most of the world, there are, in African and Afro-Atlantic cultures, tremendous resources for understanding the interconnectedness among all human beings, and indeed, among all forms of life. One of the things that I study and that gives me inspiration in a moment like this is the way Black people in this country, people who have been powerfully maligned and brutalized, have historically found ways to cultivate our own humanity, even as that humanity is denied by the structures of colonialism, racism, genocide, etc. And to affirm the shared humanity of all people. There are some profound resources in the way Africans and their descendants have understood what it is to be human. In African indigenous traditions, the deepest meanings of human life are not those of an atomized, individualized existence, separate from others and unaccountable to anyone but the self. Rather, to be human is to be in right relationship with others, with other people, and with all of the biosphere. We're all related, and our survival and our happiness is actually dependent on the survival and the well-being, the happiness of others around us. So, our beautiful task is to mobilize civic, economic, cultural, spiritual, and political power in our country to make sure that everyone who is here can breathe. We have wonderful examples in the state of Colorado of people who lived their lives with that emphasis, from Corky and Jerry Gonzalez and their family to Elder Troy Lynn Yellowwood, Minoru Yasui, Dr. Rachel Noel, Dr. Gwen Thomas, and Dr. Cecil Glenn, and so many others. Like them, we can and must use our creativity as human beings, our imaginations, our wisdoms, to develop a society where sharing has a higher value than the accumulation of wealth, and where we understand that there is no separate solution for any of us here. African indigenous tradition and African Americans have so much vital wisdom for this project, the work of developing a healthy, just multiracial democracy where there's room for everybody and where everybody can breathe. I'm closing for real now with a short quote from Gwendolyn Brooks. This comes from a poem she wrote in honor of the great artist, athlete, and activist, Paul Robeson. But the words speak to all of us in the moment. She says, "We are each other's harvest. We are each other's business. We are each other's magnitude and bond." Thank you.
Thank you so much. First of all, I just want to say I'm very proud of you. You all really brought some knowledge tonight, and I asked you to do something very difficult, to do this in a short amount of time, and maybe even some would argue it's kind of ridiculous that I asked that of you, but thank you for meeting that challenge. So I want to ask you a few questions, and we're just going to have just really quick answers here. And so, Mike, if we can go to a gallery view, so we have everybody. I'm going to start off with WENDELL, and then we're just going to go down the line and have you answer this question. Please, no interrupting. I have a mute button, which I will use. So, WENDELL, let me start off with you. If there was one thing that you believe would make a difference with race relations, what would it be and why? Hey, WENDELL, do we have WENDELL?
Sorry, I muted myself. I'm unmuted. I think for me, what I was going to say is that I use an exercise in one of my classes called the self-identity in the pie chart, because a lot of people are just not comfortable in how they approach people. And what I would preach is that we have multiple identities, and in order to get in touch with your identity, draw the best circle that you possibly can and pretend it's one of Adrian's pies and divide that pie into as many slices that represent your identity. So I'm an African-American male, basketball junkie, fly fishing fool, husband, Christian, father, grandfather. And what people don't realize is they have multiple identities, but we typically just label people based on stereotypes and biases that we have. And so what I tell, my law enforcement group is when you approach an African-American on a stop, because all the bad stuff with cops happens typically at stops, think of what's in their pie, and don't just think of them and react with your biases to them being African-American and bad and dangerous, but think about what's in their pie. And I think that's what everybody needs to do, is kind of diversify your identities and look at some of those things that make you more like a person rather than opposite them. And so that's a technique that I use.
Thank you. And may we definitively say that it has to be sweet potato pie?
Okay.
All right, good. Denise, what do you think about that question? What would be the one thing you would do?
These are hard questions, Adrian. So, and I know you know that, but I think it's honest dialogue and conversations like the one that we're having here. And I think important in that is that we can't ignore or excuse or deny our sins. And instead, we must confront them. Racism, xenophobia, white supremacy, because I think it's in confronting our sins that we can make things right.
All right. Anthony, what do you think?
Well, absolutely. I believe that we have to have a certain level of courage and willingness to be uncomfortable, because these are very uncomfortable conversations. So perhaps one of the challenges would be to get comfortable feeling uncomfortable, because as Americans, I believe there's a tendency to be intellectually lazy it's easier not to think about and grapple with these difficult issues. It's easier just to go along with the status quo. But this does require work, some honest and some authentic work. So having the courage to face this reality will actually take a lot of effort.
Thank you. And Rachel, what about you? What are your thoughts on this subject?
Yes, these are wonderful responses that my colleagues have given so far. The only thing that I would add, and I guess as an educator, it's what I think about all the time, is how important it is for us to know the fullness of our history. Because just as folks have been saying tonight, that we do have a very difficult history, myself included, I've been saying this too, a very difficult history of trauma, of injustice, of violence in our country. We also have a history of many people of all races who had another vision of what this country could be like. And I think it's important for us to gather and share those stories so that we know the names of folks, the abolitionists, the labor organizers, the people who were involved in creating Head Start programs and Vista and model cities. I mean, there are lots of examples in our country, both in our distant history and our more recent history, of people who wanted to find out what it really takes to make a healthy, multiracial, just society and to make it work for everybody. So I would say for us to be willing to look at the difficulties, but also to study the examples of people who had a vision for a multiracial democracy and to follow some of the models that they've left for us.
Thank you. All right, we're going to transition to the audience questions. So I'm going to stay with you, Rachel. One question that we received is, can you speak about the role of faith and specifically organized religion and how it can act as a catalyst for the civil rights movements?
Yes, okay. I love that question because, of course, one of the things that I pay a lot of attention to in my work is religion and spirituality and the way in which that helps feed an alternative meaning of the human, particularly for people who are in situations where their humanity is being denied, colonized people, people who are suffering genocide, people who are suffering under slavery or racism. And so I would say, just to give you a simple, relatively simple, brief example from the experience of African Americans, one of the primary ways that Black people in this country held on to an alternative sense of who we were. The outside society, white supremacy, the slavocratic structures, Jim Crow, mainstream society in general was saying that something's wrong with Black people, that Black people are somehow inferior. And yet, through religion, and this is whether it's Christianity, Islam, indigenous religion, one of the beautiful things in my experience of studying religion of people of African descent is that that is a place where Black people found the resources, the wisdom to say, I am a child of God, and my value does not depend on what a racist white supremacist society says about me. And that consciousness was absolutely essential for Black communities to have in order to build the structures that became the foundation for the Southern Freedom Movement and the Civil Rights Movement and even the Black Power and Black Consciousness Movement. Black people had to understand that our understanding of who we are and our understanding of our connection to spirit, to God, was more significant in the life of the world than what white supremacist white people thought about us. So religion has that very important role of giving us a grounding so that we can have the strength and the confidence and the capacity to fight for the transformation of the society and for the transformation of ourselves.
Thank you. Anthony, I'm going to ask you this next question.
Sure.
what is the current strategy for increasing knowledge and understanding of cultural differences for all races in Colorado? We don't just have a black-white issue. There's the indigenous experience, the concept of whiteness has changed over time. So how would you answer that question?
Well, first of all, let me say that there's no strategy, simply because our educational system does not have one. Our political system does not have one. There's no system in the state or in the country that actually has a strategy. So it's a fair question, but it is really incumbent upon the leadership uh, of our community and the various institutions to actually develop one, because we continue to miseducate children about their history. We continue to have adults who are unaware about their true history. So, one quick example: I remember teaching at the University of Colorado down here in Springs. I taught the same class for over 20 years. It's called the Psychology of Diversity. And many of my students were extremely angry when they learned some of the information about America that they had not heard in high school or in other college classes. So our challenge is to actually create some honesty so that we can actually develop a strategy to begin to properly educate our kids in public school, but also at the universities and colleges as well, because they're lacking just as we were lacking. I went to the University of Denver for my doctorate degree. There was not one class on how to work effectively with people of color. Not one class that was required. There was not even an elective. So therefore, we have a number of professionals who just simply don't have a clue because there has been no strategy, and there still does not exist one. I think with the various organizations, we can probably dialogue and come up with something, but certainly it's something which our society, which our community has the responsibility to do, because it does not exist currently.
Thank you. All right, Denise, I'm going to actually combine two questions that we got.
Well, that's not fair.
I know. I'm throwing a curveball at you. What is the most important thing that you think white people should do now to dismantle mass incarceration? And are there unique challenges in Colorado, or are these issues of mass incarceration pretty consistent across the country?
Mass incarceration is definitely an issue across the country, but I do think that we are in some ways in a historical time where we need to do something more audacious and more bold. And we need to push those individuals that are elected from the governor on down to make fundamental changes in laws that perpetuate mass incarceration and therefore the disproportionate impact on our brown, black, and indigenous people. We need to ratchet all of those things up. We need a lot more work on police reform. We need a lot more accountability on the streets to the people that those individuals are hired to serve. So I think that's and what the white community can do is be a voice. I think that there's a point in time where they need to stand back, but there's also a point in time to do the chant and do the calls for change.
Yeah, and it sounds like we need to be as tenacious as that dog, maybe.
Yeah, right. You know, it's a little 6-pound chihuahua, just so everybody knows.
All right, cool. All right, I'm going to answer one of the questions, and it says, in what areas or populations have you yourself participated in elements of repression, and what has this examination revealed? So I go back to several years ago when I was in law school. I was working part-time at a firm, and I was talking to one of the legal assistants, and she was telling me how when she would come home, she would physically check every room in her apartment before she felt secure. And that blew me away because, when I go home, I just plop on the couch, turn on SportsCenter, and I'm secure. So it caused me to think about issues of patriarchy and male privilege, even as an African-American man in this society. And thinking about what women go through actually deepened my thoughts of race, because I thought, well, look, I'm a good guy, and I had never thought about that. So then I thought about, okay, if you're a white person in this society and you're never really in a situation where you have to think about race, what does that mean to bring that person into the conversation? So that was just my own process of discovery. All right, last audience question I want to give to Wendell. I've always been someone who is infinitely curious about other people, and I used to feel comfortable talking to people about things for mine, but lately I feel nervous that I'm going to say the wrong thing. What advice would you give to that person?
Well, I want to build on the exercise regarding the pie, the self-identity in the pie chart, and to basically assume that people have multiple identities that are important to them. And I think that you need to be curious about what some of those identities are and not just label them based upon their physical features or color of their skin or even gender. And like I said, the self-identity in the pie chart exercise is one of the best tools to do that. I think also unpacking. There's a great article about unpacking your beliefs where it gives the example of a white judge only having African American or minority people in front of her to sentence, and so she said she felt that that she was being biased toward that particular group until she went to another colleague's courtroom where there were white defendants also being sentenced. So unpacking and getting out of your comfort zone, I think, is another example of that, because I think we do have this incredible society that we just know so little about because we tend to be constrained by our own identities and groups. And where we get our identity is from those groups that are represented by those slices in the pie. So think about that and think about diversifying your identities and unpacking some of your beliefs about the different groups that you don't associate with.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And again, thank you everyone for being a part of this first event. And I just want to thank you who are watching, because I know that you're being pulled in a lot of different directions. You're busy, but you gave us some of your time tonight, and we thank you for that. But this is important. It's going to take people of goodwill, people like you, in order for us to finally have a breakthrough and make progress. But please understand that we're all on a journey with this. We're all learning. And undergoing a reckoning is a messy process, especially trying to get on the road towards equality and justice. We're dealing with centuries of stuff. We're talking about things that people haven't thought about, and we're talking about things that people don't want to think about. But the journey is something that we can do and we must do with a spirit of determination, understanding, humility, respect, and love for one another. Good night. Now I'll turn it over to Maggie.
Thank you, Adrian, and thank you, panelists. Thanks to all of you for sharing your knowledge, your experiences, your insights. I wish we had longer to speak with you, but I'm sure we'll be able to do some additional programs and have some longer conversations. Thank you very much for helping us better understand the legacy of race in America. Thanks also to the audience members who posed questions. We weren't able to get to all of those questions this evening, but you can continue the conversation online in our Legacy of Race Facebook group and at future programs. And our next program will be on Wednesday, December 9th at 7 p.m. I invite you to visit our website, coloradohumanities.org, to find out about the next program and to explore resources for further study and discussion of the legacy of race and ethnicity. Thank you again to our sponsors and our partners. Please join us for the rest of the series and have a good evening.